Shana Tova. I want to speak with you today about the process of teshuva, repentance, or more accurately translated as return. As Rabbi Silverstein has taught us, teshuva is a multi-step process for personal, spiritual repair and renewal. It requires cheshbon hanefesh, reviewing the past, opening our souls, taking a spiritual accounting of what we've done. Hakarat hachet, identifying a sin or something wrong we've done. And then charata, feeling genuine remorse. And more steps until you achieve teshuva gemura, complete repentance, when you reach the phase of azivah, of being put in the same situation again and avoiding repeating the same mistake. This is such a helpful framework for all of us as we review personal missteps and strive to improve. But it also has usefulness as a framework for communal or societal teshuva, a reckoning for things that we as a society have done wrong and we wish to repair. So I want to talk to you today about how this framework might be useful for us as America reckons with a history and legacy of racism and racial inequality. But before I do, I have to tell you that this is not an easy topic for me to address. Frankly, I'm nervous, because the discourse in our society has made these issues so polarizing that it's hard to speak without being perceived as political or insensitive or inaccurate. But I decided to speak about it because I believe we must have this conversation. Because a Jewish approach to teshuva or repentance affirms a naive notion that no matter how bad things get, repair is always possible if we have the will to do it. I will try to speak humbly and honestly, and as always, I hope that my words are just the beginning of a conversation and not the end. Rabbi, is racism really a topic that we should talk about on Rosh Hashanah? After all, with so much going on in the world, a global pandemic, the rise of anti-Semitism in new and increasingly complex ways, historic developments in Israel, we're going to take time on one of the holiest days of our calendar to talk about racism? Teach us how to be more Jewish, how to incorporate Shabbat into our lives, or how to pray. My answer is yes. This is a topic we should address, and dafka, precisely today, because this is fundamental to our story as Jews and our vision of the world. Why is it that so many black spirituals turn to Moses or the Israelites as a paradigm for liberation? Because that is the Jewish story, the story of oppression to freedom. When God brought us out of slavery, God also charged us to be a people committed to pursuing justice for all. Because when we talk about the creation of the universe in Judaism, we talk about building a world in which we affirm that every person is created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Because racism affects Jews of color, and because as a minority ourselves, when we stand up with and for the rights of other minority groups, the progress that we make together benefits all of us. So where do we begin? If we think about that 7-step process that Rabbi Silverstein has taught us, cheshbon hanefesh, spiritual accounting, identifying the sin, feeling remorse for the sin, apologizing, making it right, abandoning the sin, where do you think we are as a country, as a society in that process? Have we done cheshbon hanefesh? Have we reflected on our past wrongs? Do we feel remorse for a history of racism? What have we done to repair the damage that has been done? As you know, slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment in 1865, 155 years ago. But when slavery ended, equality was not magically achieved. Another century of segregation, of voter suppression, and inequality led to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And even if the 1960s brought legal equality, the legacy of slavery persists. We have a criminal justice system that does not treat people as equal before the law, not to mention significant economic inequality along racial lines. As Brian Stevenson famously said, slavery didn't end in 1865, it evolved. Racism is not the only obstacle facing America for sure, but is certainly one of the most pressing. People of good conscience can disagree on the best methods and policies to address this evil. But if the events of this past summer and the events of recent years have taught us anything, it's that there is still more work to do in order to heal this painful wound. Because the wound is so painful, and because it brings up shame and anger, we find ourselves in this unending loop. Cries for justice turn into protest movements, which are met with opposition and violence, which leads to backlash, which leads to more oppression, and nothing ever changes. But Judaism affirms that change is possible, that teshuva makes progress possible. And I believe that our tradition, specifically what our tradition says about teshuva, can help us both understand the problem better and address it. I'd like to teach you two texts about teshuva that might add some contours to the conversation that America is having at this time. I'm grateful to my teachers, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Rabbi Eitan Rubenstein, and Rabbi Benny Lau for first introducing me to these texts. I think they're wonderful and rich, and I'm excited to share them with you. The first text comes from the Talmud in Masechet Gitin, in which the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai are engaged in a dispute over what to do about a house that was built around Marish Hagazul, a stolen beam. Picture the image for a moment, a beautiful house built, but at its center, at its foundation, is one beam that was stolen. What do we do with such a house? The house of Shammai says, you must tear down the entire house and return the beam to the rightful owner. Now, Shammai's position makes some sense. The beam was stolen. It should be returned. That's just and fair. But Hillel disagrees. He argues that if the cost of rectifying the wrong is so high, such that a person will have to destroy his home in the process, he may choose not to confess at all. He might just keep the stolen beam and never do teshuva. And for Hillel, that is an outcome he cannot accept. So Hillel says, let him pay the value of the beam and keep the house intact. Now, both Hillel and Shammai agree that something must be done to repair the wrong. Shammai is willing to go to an extreme to set things right, whereas Hillel is concerned about making teshuva reasonable and accessible, about incentivizing people to heal the wound. If the cost is too high, people just won't do it, and the house will remain with a moral flaw in its foundation. Now, for those of you who are students of Talmud, you know that we tend to follow Hillel in most cases, and this is no exception. I believe this text offers us a compelling metaphor for America. This country was built by great people with incredible vision, but it was also a vision that rendered many of the inhabitants of the country invisible. The same documents that brought us the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness also brought us the 3/5 compromise. America was built around a stolen beam of slavery and slave labor. Consider the following excerpt from Ta-Nehisi Coates' 2014 article that appeared in the Atlantic magazine. He writes, "The wealth accorded America by slavery was not just in what slaves pulled from the land, but in the slaves themselves. In 1860, slaves as an asset were worth more than all of America's manufacturing, all of the railroads, all of the productive capacity of the United States put together." That's according to Yale historian David Blight. And he notes further, slaves were the single largest by far financial asset of property in the entire American economy. the vending of the black body and the sundering of the black family became an economy unto themselves, estimated to have brought in tens of millions of dollars to antebellum America. It's not clear to me how you do teshuva for something as morally grotesque as American slavery. But the debate of the stolen beam gives us a framework to consider our options. We hear the voice of Shammaites in our society today saying, tear the whole house down and let's rebuild a new house, a more just house. And that makes some sense. But I tend to agree with Hillel. This house is a beautiful house, and it's our home. And to tear it down would be too painful and too costly. So let's see what we can do about making whole the people from whom dignity, liberty, and equality was taken, to repair what was done so that we might be able to move forward together. Before I teach you the second text, I want to tell you a funny story that happened to me when I was in college. As an international relations student, I was required to take a foreign language, and I decided to study Arabic. I thought I was headed into a career in the Foreign Service or the CIA. It turns out I was headed in a different direction. But in my first year Arabic class, we were asked at the end of the year to give an oral presentation in Arabic, and our professor, I remember him still. His name is Ahmed Rushdie. He was an Egyptian man who was visiting from the American University in Cairo. My oral presentation was scheduled for the spring, right around Passover. So I decided to give my presentation on the topic of Eid al-Fasah, which is the holiday of Passover. I spoke, in my limited Arabic vocabulary, about how the Egyptians gave us hard work and Allah took us out of slavery to freedom. And at the end of the presentation, Professor Rushdie looked at me, and there was a sincere look on his face. And he said, "Great presentation, Ari. I'm so sorry for what my people did to your people." Now, I laughed. Obviously, I didn't expect this modern Egyptian Arabic professor to apologize to me, a modern American Jew. Certainly not for Egyptian slavery, which happened nearly 3,000 years ago. So I chuckled and I said, that's really not necessary. I'm over it. But I wonder, would that exchange have been different if my people were still oppressed? If we as Jews were still underrepresented in government? If we didn't have a homeland of our own? If I were not given the same opportunities to get an education or a job or a fair salary or have access to health care during a pandemic, if the wound were not only still fresh, but still painful, still smarting, still hurting, still healing, would I have laughed off his comment? I don't think so. Avadim hayinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. We tell the story as if it happened to us. But we do so to reinforce our history, not because it's reflective of our current reality. Here's text number 2. Maybe this one can also help. It's a text about teshuva, and this time it comes again from the Talmud, from Masechet Bava Kama. It reads as follows. If a father left his children a stolen cow, or a piece of clothing, or anything specific, the children are required to return it because of their father's honor. It seems pretty straightforward. If your father stole something, you should return it. That will honor your father by righting the wrong that he perpetrated. But the Talmud probes this position. Does this really honor your father? Perhaps your father did not wish to return the stolen item, and so by doing so, you would be violating his wishes. Or, more likely, by shining a light on the crime, it might bring shame to your father's legacy, his reputation. What obligation do the children actually have here? They didn't steal a thing. And the rabbis conclude with a fascinating resolution to this problem. They say, we presume that the father repented. He did teshuva on his deathbed, but he didn't manage to return the stolen item before he died. Now, what the rabbis have done here is magnificent. We make a presumption that when faced with the ultimate judgment, a person nearing the end of his life, that person wants to right all the wrongs he perpetrated in his lifetime. He wants to confess. He wants to do teshuva. We assume that our ancestors wanted to do the right thing, even if he didn't get around to it in his lifetime. And so our responsibility is to carry forward the work that he was not able to complete. In doing teshuva, in doing that which is right and good, we're not dishonoring the memory of our ancestors, say the rabbis. In fact, we're honoring it. In some of the discourse around these issues, we see people who wish to disown our fathers. Fathers with names like Jefferson and Washington, they call them racists or bigots. In my opinion, this is not helpful. A more helpful approach would demand of us to be honest about the sins of our fathers, yes, but to continue the process that they began and keep doing the work that they started. It honors their legacy to expand the ideas of liberty they bequeathed us to even more people who live in this great country, and to make right that which they got wrong. As Jews, we don't disown the generations that have come before us. We don't erase our history. On our parents' merits, we arrived here. But we also acknowledge that they were not perfect. None of us is. And so we learn from their example, we draw inspiration from their teachings, and we seek to carry forward the work they began with hopes that our children will carry forward our work after we're gone. The Torah in its day was radical in taking steps towards limiting slavery. It declared that a fugitive or refugee slave who escaped the land of Israel could not be returned to his master in another land. Israel was and should be a place of refuge for those fleeing oppression, and the people of Israel should always be champions of the oppressed. Deuteronomy charged that emancipated slaves should be furnished liberally from the master's flock, so that they don't leave slavery empty-handed. These were great steps forward in the time and historical context of the Torah. The founding fathers were also revolutionary in advancing liberty in their day. Their examples should encourage us to be equally radical and courageous in advancing those ideals in our own time. Now, I know many of you have concerns about this work. I do too. We've spent a fair amount of time and energy in recent weeks and months asking questions like whether or not we can join in the language of Black Lives Matter, when some who march under that banner have also expressed anti-Semitic or anti-Israel sentiments. We feel uneasy about the images of looting that we see on TV. I want you to know I share these concerns. I share the unease. These are things that should make us uneasy. And we must also not let that fear prevent us from doing our part in the necessary teshuva work that must be done. In this blessedly diverse congregation, we will inevitably come to different conclusions about how best to do the work of confronting and combating racism in our society, and that's okay. But what's not okay is if we spend all of our time focused on those symptoms of a deeper spiritual problem that will not go away until and unless we confront it as a society. There are those who think that the teshuva process is not necessary. Remember those steps of teshuva that I mentioned earlier? They ask, can't we just jump to step 7? Haven't we already done teshuva as a society? I treat everyone with respect and dignity. I don't discriminate based on race. Why do we need to dig up all this old history and talk about it? After all, I didn't steal a beam. My family wasn't even in this country when all those terrible things were happening. I think this perspective was best articulated by Chief Justice Roberts as an argument against affirmative action when he said, "The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating based on race." I agree with the Chief Justice with one significant caveat, and it's a caveat that I learned from Jewish texts on teshuva. Not repeating the same mistake is the end of a process that was meant to force an individual to contend with the wrong that was done, to make restitution to the wronged party. So while I may not have stolen anything, I must recognize how the same systems that were available to me and to my family, loans from banks, adequate medical care, protection from law enforcement, the GI Bill, those systems have not historically been equitable and are not today. And so there is still, I believe, teshuva work to be done. I want to conclude by telling you my own family story. And I want to tell it in two different ways, and I hope in both versions of my family story, many of you will find points of commonality. And I hope that it will become clear to you by the end why I'm telling it to you. Here's version one. My maternal grandparents came here with nothing. As refugees from World War II, survivors of the Shoah. They each lost family members in the war at the hands of the Nazis. Yimach Shemam, may their memories be erased. They lost their entire world in the war, but thank God they survived. Bubi and Zaidi met in a DP camp in Paris after the war. They moved to Israel where they were married. They were both Zionists, and Bubi wanted to stay in Israel. But the underdeveloped Herzliya of 1946 Israel, which was mostly sand dunes at the time, well, it wasn't up to Zaidi's standards of European sophistication, so they moved to Washington Heights. Little did they know that Washington Heights wasn't the peak of sophistication either. But they built a life here. Zaidi opened up a dry cleaner and Bubi was the seamstress. They worked hard and eventually they were able to move to the Bronx and then to buy a little home, a single-family home in Little Neck in Queens. My mother received a good education in New York City public schools, and Bubi and Zaidi impressed upon her the importance of an education. She studied math and music at Douglas College at Rutgers University and was able, together with my father, to provide an upper-middle-class childhood for me and my sisters. We went to private Jewish day schools and private universities. We experienced the best privileges that America has to offer. Theirs is truly an American success story. For a long time, I believed that this was possible for anyone. They came as immigrants with nothing, with less than nothing. They had lost so much and were traumatized in their childhoods, and yet they were able to rebuild. Their courage inspires me even today. But if you look more closely at my family story, if you listen to this second version, you start to see where they got a little bit of help along the way. First, that they were able to enter this country as refugees at all, even though there were many in society who thought that they might be Soviet spies. They were helped by a bank that gave them a loan to buy a home in suburban Queens where they accumulated most of their wealth. They were helped by reparations from the German government, which paid for treatments for my Zaidi's arthritis that he got during the war. And yes, by the support of the Jewish community and the Krakow Society. They were blessed to have adequate health insurance for my Uncle Chucky's persistent medical issues. They got a little bit of help along the way. Think of the other stories of American success. Think of those who fought for their country and were able to build a life because of the GI Bill, or other government programs that made it possible for people to realize their dreams. Telling the story this way doesn't take anything away from my grandparents' resilience or hard work. It doesn't take away from their courage, but it does paint a fuller picture of the blessings that this country has conferred upon them and how this country has made their lives possible. These are blessings that they never took for granted. They always thought this was the greatest country in the world, and they instilled that belief in me. But these support systems, healthcare, home loans, government programs for veterans, reparations, were not available equally to all Americans who also work hard and strive for a better life. Success in this country is possible when people like my grandparents work hard to rise up, yes, but also when they're not pushed back down every time they try to. So I believe there is still teshuva work to be done. Let us all do the work of slicha, of forgiveness, of repair, and Kabbalah la'atid, resolving to be different from the generations of the past. And then perhaps we might be able to achieve azivah, a world in which we release humanity from the painful scourge of racism. I invite you to join me in committing to being part of a national movement of teshuva, to try and heal the historic wrongs of slavery and its ongoing legacy of racism. For some, this might mean activism. Others will engage in learning and reflection. Others still might think about changes to their own behavior, ideas, or choices. Each of us should, I believe, figure out the best way to engage this important issue. Members of our own community have already taken the lead in organizing efforts on behalf of our congregation. They provided some reflective material for you that you should have received in your email. It's probably still in your inbox somewhere as part of the emails we sent out to prepare for these high holy days. Maybe that's a good place to start, with some reading or listening to podcasts. Or perhaps you'll join me in one of our upcoming book club discussions or movie discussions that we have planned for the coming months on this topic. Whatever you choose to do, I believe it will help to heal the part of our own soul that longs for justice and reconciliation with our fellow human being and with the Almighty who redeemed us from slavery so that we could tell a story of liberation and redemption that would inspire the world. When we heal the wrongs of our past, then we can truly greet a new year with joy and optimism. Shana Tova.